Hello, it's Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this second session, we'll finish our conversation about product and service development. Before you watch this video, you should make sure that you've completed the assignments identified in the first section of this conversation. You certainly can watch this, listen to this first, but you'll get a lot more out of it if you've actually completed the work that's been described. So let's just follow up real quickly on the example from David Friedberg, where he was talking about weather.com, or the weather company, I think is what it was, the weather company or weather bill. And you might have wondered, how did that turn out? I mean, it seems a little bit crazy. And at the time that that video was taken, they had raised some money and they were working on the opportunity, and it certainly seemed like a big idea, but it was a little unclear exactly how it was going to develop. But as you can see here, obviously, ultimately the company was changed to Climate Corporation, and the organization had narrowed in on a couple of very specific target markets associated with agriculture. Originally, Climate or Weather Bill had thought it might go after companies like the bike rental place in San Francisco, but the reality was that the focus needed to be on organizations where weather impacts were not a convenience issue, as in the case with the guy who doesn't come in when it's raining because nobody rents bikes, but where it's a matter of whether the business actually survives or not. And as they moved further and further into agriculture, it became clear that their acquisition was not going to be an insurance company. It was going to be someone in the agricultural field. And as you can see, it turned out to be Monsanto, who purchased the company for just about $1 billion. So I emphasize this because it's really, really important to recognize that it's not the idea or the innovation, it's how it gets used in the market. And in this particular situation, the ultimate target market turned out to drive not just where they were able to build business, but ultimately the exit process and the exit opportunity that became available to them. This then gets at the problem with creativity in organizations, right? You might have discovered as you were doing your own brainstorming that, individual creativity tends to work best when it's unconstrained and unrewarded. It's actually quite difficult when someone says to you, I need 10 ideas right now or in the next couple of minutes. And the amazing thing is that psychological research has shown that financial incentives actually reduce creativity. If you put creative people in a room, give them a time limit, and tell them you're going to financially reward them, they will actually come up with fewer and less creative ideas than if you gave them an unconstrained situation where there weren't the same type of stresses or incentives. So we need to recognize that most organizations don't, in fact, need unconstrained creativity. What they need is managed innovation that addresses unmet needs. So organizational innovation, this early process of product development or service development, needs to be both encouraged as well as managed. And this is one of the great challenges and tensions in technology entrepreneurship, because it's almost always driven by a really creative process where innovations have been generated, sometimes with some market or customer information, but very often with very little market or customer information. Product development needs to take into account that over time, business and technology-based business is increasing in complexity. So product complexity is generally increasing, and the rate of change in markets is increasing, right? Access to information, rapid distribution systems. This means that the challenge of forecasting product requirements is going up exponentially. And you might be saying, well, what on earth does that mean? What it means is that as the rate of technological and market change increases, attempting to forecast what product requirements are going to be needed in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months is going up faster than we can predict, right? So it used to be that you could predict market changes in terms of customer need evolution reasonably well over 4 to 6 months or even a year. But as products become more complex and as markets change more quickly, that is becoming more and more difficult to do. Now, there are some indications that big data systems and AI may be able to improve this, but then you're betting on how good an AI system is, and realistically, many early stage companies are not going to have access to the kinds of capabilities that are going to be required. So then what's going to determine which companies succeed in actually bringing valuable products to market? Now, your book walks through a fairly sophisticated process for product development, in which there's an effort to develop a design, moving into prototyping, and then ultimately into final prototyping and decisions. And I really want you to be aware of these processes. I want you to recognize the steps in them. You don't need to necessarily have them memorized, but you do need to understand how this process actually works. So please take a look through this, make sure you're kind of familiar with it and understand what's going on here. But this kind of flowchart, while useful in sort of a vacuum, needs to be mediated by a recognition of where you are in the early stage of technology entrepreneurship. This is where lean startup thinking comes in. And lean startup is a framework that really has only been developed about for the last 10 years. That challenges sort of a traditional framework for product development. Lean startup assumes that product development is in itself an experiment, right? And that your idea is only a hypothesis. And that what you want to do as quickly as possible is build something that you can put in front of prospective customers and get feedback from them, right? Now, this needs to be tempered with the reality that depending on which industry you're in, this may or may not be more or less difficult to do. For example, if you are in the biotechnology industry, then creating a prototype that you can actually test with customers may be impossible. But there are still ways that you can address this sort of build, measure, learn framework by being in early conversation with the FDA, recognizing how physicians and care providers actually treat patients, and how patients receive care, and so on and so forth. Build, measure, learn is the mantra of the lean startup. The idea that rather than go through this extremely sophisticated product development cycle, you create the simplest possible prototype that can be used to test your assumptions about what customers are willing to use and pay for. So let's think about this for a second. Let's go back to something really, really easy. We want to open a restaurant, and maybe you've been very focused on environmental issues and thinking about ways that we might change the food supply chain and issues in long-term environmental and climate sustainability. And you've discovered that there is this wonderful product out there which is actually relatively easy to grow in very large quantities, which is highly nutritious and yet not really utilized as a foodstuff in most cultures. It's kelp. It's nutritious, it's sustainable, and oh my gosh, is it green. The problem is, of course, that if you wanted to open a restaurant to serve kelp-based foods, you'd discover very quickly that opening a restaurant's actually quite expensive, depending on where you're going to open it, how big it's going to be, and so on and so forth. So when we're looking at something like maybe spending $500,000, that's a lot to spend to test an idea. So take a moment here, and I would encourage you to pause the recording and see if you can think of a way that we could test our ideas quickly and less expensively than spending $500,000 to open a restaurant. I hope you took a minute or two to think about this, but whether or not you did, I want to give you some suggestions. So rather than open an entire restaurant, something you could do would be to open a food cart, right? So a restaurant's going to cost you $500,000. Opening a food cart will probably cost you around $20,000. So somewhere on, say, Library Mall at the University of Wisconsin-Madison could be a really interesting place to test out this idea. Let's have a kelp cart. We'll give it a fun name, and we'll paint the whole thing green, and we'll drag it out there around lunchtime most days, and we'll see how many people buy it, and we'll ask them what they think as they're trying it. We'll compare the line and how much we serve to what's going on at the other food carts, and we'll begin to get a sense of whether or not this is something that people will actually buy. But there are even simpler experiments that don't require $20,000. We could probably spend a couple $100 and produce a series of small food bites in small containers, and we could hopefully get authorization to safely, for example, sell these food bites in your dorm or an apartment. Or maybe we would just simply give away samples. We would say, here, try this and see what you think. These are using the lean startup framework of let's put something in front of customers as quickly as we can and find out whether people are actually interested or not. And as we go through this prototyping process where our customers say, oh, I liked this kelp recipe, but not that one. I would like a larger quantity or a smaller quantity. It'd be really nice to have bread with this, or maybe you could add tofu to it. And now we begin to build up a profile of what a viable full product might look like that we could actually serve in restaurants when we're ready to make the $500,000 investment. It's important to recognize that organizational innovation and product and service development needs to go beyond just what is the product that you actually sell. This is a really nice framework that's been developed for thinking about innovation within organizations that covers not just the what, that is the new offerings or products, but the who, the how, and the where. And sometimes a new product or service is not just the new embodiment of the product. It's who you sell it to, or how they get it, or how they capture the value out of it, or how we get it to them through a more effective supply chain, or whether there's some realignment of the brand that actually makes this more valuable. So on the next couple of slides, which I'm not going to read for you, I've just provided some short descriptions of these different elements that I would like you to at least be aware of. These are not on the chapter quiz. This is a completely separate framework. But I do want you to be aware of these so that you understand that there is more to organizational innovation than simply new product and service offerings. And as a technology entrepreneur, you need to recognize that the product or service itself is almost always not enough. And all of these factors play into whether or not you're going to have a successful market entry. So on the, I think it'll be easier. I'm just going to quickly scroll through these next two slides. These are available as a slide deck elsewhere in Canvas for you to take a look at. These simply walk through the other elements of this of organizational innovation so that you at least understand what they all are. The bottom line for product and service development in the context of technology entrepreneurship for this course is you need to review the process that's described in your textbook, and you should know the general elements. And then I want you to recognize that in a truly entrepreneurial context, it's better to experiment and validate than to focus in on following a sophisticated linear development process, and going step by step can feel very empowering. But if you're not putting ideas in front of customers or partners or industry experts, you run the risk that you go through this product or service development process, and at the end you emerge with something that customers won't actually buy. It's great to have a technological innovation that has the potential to create value, but you need to recognize that the final determinant of that value is your customer, not you.